Hey, friends and AstroFam, it's Tim Soaring Wolf, and today we're talking about the Pluto return of the United States, Part 2. I did mention just a few things in the first video, what to expect, and asked for some feedback and questions. So we will go over some of those as well, and let's get into it. So to start, I want to talk a little bit about Pluto. In mythology, Pluto was, of course, the god of the underworld, and the name Pluton actually is associated with Pluto, means wealth and mining, even the deep minerals from the earth, kind of like the seeds of wealth. So Pluto definitely affects wealth, generational wealth, legacies, that sort of thing. And the story of Pluto goes something like this. When the fall of the giants shook the earth, Pluto, out of fear that light might pour through the earth, decided to check things out and make sure his kingdom was stable, make sure the light of day couldn't pierce down into the dark underworld. So he got on his chariot and his black horses and rode to the surface. And lo and behold, off in the distance, Venus was playing with her son Cupid. Venus, just having a good old time like Venus knows how to do. And saw the Dark Lord coming up from the underworld and decided to use this opportunity to take out one of her enemies, or more specifically, one of the daughters of her enemies, Persephone. Ceres didn't like Venus. Neither did Diana the Huntress. And so Venus convinced Cupid, her son, and said, hey, we've got these enemies. Let's go ahead and use this opportunity, shoot a dart through his heart so he will fall in love with Persephone and take her away. And that's exactly what happened. He saw Persephone in the fields playing with her friends, fell immediately in love with her, and scooped her up and took her into the underworld. And then, of course, in search for her daughter, Ceres comes to find the portal where the earth swallowed her daughter up, thinking it was the earth's fault, cursed the earth. And as the goddess of agriculture and farming, she took away the seeds of the earth and the abundance of the earth. And so winter came on. And this is, of course, the story of how the seasons came. And eventually Persephone was allowed to return, but because she had eaten a pomegranate seed, she couldn't leave permanently. She had to return. And therefore, the seasons of spring and summer are said to be when Persephone returns, and then fall and winter when she has to return to the underworld to be with her husband. But that is the story of the underworld, the god of the underworld, Pluto, also associated with the name Hades, the god of the underworld. And back in those stories, there was a division of three main gods: the god of the sky, which was Zeus; the god of the water, which was Poseidon; and then the god of the underworld, Hades or Pluto. As a planet, Pluto was discovered in 1930, and Pluto was named by an 11-year-old girl. I believe her name was Venetia Burney. Um, for only world or planet to ever be named by a child. She was 11 years old at the time and suggested the Romans god's name of the underworld, and they ended up choosing that. Of course, Mickey Mouse's dog was named Pluto around that year. I believe is when he also came out, and the name was in commemoration of the planet being named Pluto. And of course, it is a very far away planet. It is therefore a very deep and far away, represents the deep seated nature of the psychology and power within all of us. And astronomically, of course, people have said he's been no longer considered a planet, but in astrology, he is still a planet. And in astrology, Pluto is considered the higher octave of Mars, and therefore the new ruler of Scorpio. Uranus is the higher octave of Mercury, Neptune, the higher octave of Venus, and Pluto, the higher octave of Mars. And therefore, Pluto has a lot of Martian qualities, is considered a malefic in astrology, of course, bringing destruction, death, and rebirth, renewal. but always destruction first. Therefore, the energies of Pluto can definitely seem dark or negative or harsh, and dealing with that destructive phase before we get to the renewal. And it isn't until the end of that complete transformation we really truly can appreciate the energy of Pluto. And so, with Pluto being so far away, he does take a long time to go around the sun, approximately 248 years, 250 years. And if you divided that up by the 12 signs, you would say approximately 20 years Pluto spends in each time. But that isn't true because of the way Pluto moves through the zodiac. As we can see in this little GIF here, by paying attention to that outer circle, Pluto is the only planet that actually goes above the ecliptic plane and then below the ecliptic plane on its revolution around the sun. Whereas all the other planets kind of orbit around the same ecliptic plane, Pluto does go above and beyond. Again, a perfect description of that Roman god of the underworld going above and then into the underworld. It's just amazing to me how an 11-year-old could name the planet. And again, it's just one of those things I believe out of the mouth of babes, God perfects wisdom, right? And it's just even not even this planet Pluto, but just all the planets is such a mystery to me how they all match the influences of the planet and how we can accurately predict what those influences will be astrologically speaking. But this is Pluto, and so because of the way it rotates around the sun and also how it moves above and below the ecliptic plane, it isn't always 20 years per sign that it goes through. Sometimes it could be as low as 14 years in one sign. It could be as high as 28 years in a sign. So it does vary. So we'll see a little bit of variation of dates, and that is the reason why. Astrologically, Pluto also represents death and rebirth. Obviously, Pluto is associated with the eighth house of the zodiac, the house of Scorpio, and all of those messages are found within that domain of the eighth house, the domain of Scorpio, and now the domain of Pluto. We've got the death and rebirth, the destruction, the renewal, lessons of power, obsession, jealousy. Again, also themes that are associated when we talk about the eighth house and Scorpio. And of course, Pluto can affect that. Pluto in our own personal chart can tell us where we derive our power, how we can reach our total power, represents lessons of power or power struggles within our own life, and can also help us to unlock our own personal power. But for a country, when we look at the birth chart of a country, we are able to see where those lessons of power come into play, which can give us a clue and insight into what will happen with the Pluto return of this country. Now, the Pluto return of this country, the exact point was last year, February 22nd, 2022. But again, being such a slow moving planet, we will see the effects of the Pluto return still for many years to come. And we can even see things leading up to it that can give us hints and clues of what is to transpire during this event and during this transit, as well as what are the lessons that we are meant to learn. Mostly lessons about power, since Pluto is that planet of power. Of course, the signs are all around us when it comes to astrology or the universe whispering to us. And when we tap into our intuition, we can tap into those messages and signs. But I love when we can look at astrology and the timing of transits just match up with events. That is how we learn about the effects of the planets on our lives through a trial and error and examples. We are going to learn about those effects. And for example, when Pluto entered Aquarius, the heralding the entrance of Pluto into an air sign. Pluto is destruction. Aquarius is an air sign. We had the worst tornado in LA in decades, and we don't hear about tornadoes in Los Angeles. That's why the unlikeliness of it happening can create such shocking images, like in movies where the Hollywood sign is being destroyed, because it just is so unlikely that that would happen. And here this happened. And luckily it wasn't deadly, but I was curious to find out how tornadoes happen in California. Apparently there are quite a few, but they are small. They don't cause a lot of damage. But the last or the worst tornado to hit Los Angeles was actually March 1st, 1983. 9 people died, uh, 30 injured, 5 million in damages. So it was tragic. It was very sad, of course. Loss of lives. And that was the worst tornado recorded. And it was when Pluto was in Libra. It was in the last degree of Libra, the 29th degree, leaving Libra. Libra is an air sign, and it would not touch another air sign until March 23rd, 2023. So little coincidences like that are very interesting. But we will go over lots more history, and we'll try to stick to historical facts. There are lots of conspiracies right now. And interestingly enough, Pluto does kind of rule conspiracies. And here in the United States, we're seeing a lot of conspiracies about a lot of things that are happening. Pluto probes deep to get to the truth. Pluto does cover those taboo subjects that no one wants to talk about. They have eighth house subjects: death, rebirth, sex. Those are all of the things in politics and religion that we're told to stay away from those subjects at the dinner table or in public, to not create division. But those are the subjects of the eighth house and the subjects of Pluto. So taboos and mysteries and conspiracies will abound and come out, shedding light on those things that have been hidden, the darkness, the shadow self of what this country has tried to hide, will be coming out into the open as a revision and a review of the power of this country, the United States. So, before we get into what's happening in the United States and going over the Pluto return of the United States, I want to look at other countries' Pluto returns, since this is the first one for the United States. We can learn more about Pluto returns through other countries at this point, just because this is the first time for this country. So, there are countries that have survived their Pluto return, and we're going to look at some of those. One of them is the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, according to history, is said to have started around 27 BCE. And the first Pluto return for the Roman Empire would have been around 216 to 223 AD. And this was a period of instability. This was the end of the Severan dynasty. And with the death of the last Severan family, there was also the crisis of the 3rd century, which again was created an instability in the Roman Empire and its power structure, its government. However, they actually survived it. But the second Pluto return of the Roman Empire brought a lot of enemies to its borders. The Battle of Cap Bon in 468 brought a lot of destruction to the Roman invasion fleets and Rome itself. And then that would lead to the actual collapse and fall of the Roman Empire, which was between 476 and 493 AD. So that second Pluto return kind of leads right into that collapse of the Roman Empire. We see that timeline of that 250-year marker as well as that 500-year marker, which can be directly tied to Pluto. But definitely political instability, power struggles, dramatic change, but not always death in the first Pluto return. So this doesn't necessarily mean the end of the United States or the end of this country as a whole, the death of a country, but it is a transformation. There will be some instability politically, and there will be power struggles for sure. So now let's explore a little bit of United States roots, going all the way back to 1066. And I say a little bit of the United States roots because the US has its roots from Great Britain and England. England, the beginning of the English Empire, according to astrologers, is said to have begun December 25th, 1066, with the coronation of William the Conqueror, who would later pass the throne to his firstborn son. So this was the time of rise up of the country of England, and the first Pluto return of the country, a couple hundred years later, would be during 1311 to 1315. And this was a time of great struggle for Great Britain or England back then. And there was a great famine during that time, which a lot of environmental disasters that led to the Great Famine that killed millions of people, that led to a lot of social unrest, and eventually the division of the Scots from the Brits. So again, there was a realignment of power, reduction, a separation, death and rebirth there. But it survived. It survived its first Pluto return, and there was that realignment of power. Now, in the second Pluto return of England was around 1555 to 1562. And this is where we see breaking off of England from the Church of England and the Protestants. There was a lot of um, changes that were done in the government and had to do with the religion and with the Church of England and those other things. But this was also a time when Queen Mary rose to the throne, and she was the first queen that was not jointed to a king. So the first woman to rule the country that wasn't actually connected to a king. So a realignment of power, a kind of revolution of power to have the first woman be the queen. And she wasn't a nice queen. She was known to be Bloody Mary, the person that killed all of these Protestants, persecuted them um, for the religion. But yeah, she killed millions of people, had a lot of people put to death. And it was during her reign and also Queen Elizabeth that also we see the beginning of the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. So this would be, again, lessons of power. Pluto does rule those lessons of power that have to deal with slavery and bondage and oppression. And this would be the beginning of that slave trade in those years. Now, the last Pluto return of the English Empire is said to be 215 years later, 1801, would be the new birth chart for the United Kingdom. This would be the creation of the United Kingdom, so basically the end of the English power. But it happened right after the United States claimed their own independence and separated from England. And this hurt that kind of England a lot. You know, they lost the 13 colonies through the American Revolution and the establishment of America, the United States of America. And they did also lose other colonies around the world during this time. Again, a reduction in power and basically the end of that English empire. England during this time was not popular. There was a lot of power struggles. I'm going to show you guys. Look at all of these wars that happened around England's last Pluto return, the end of the English Empire in 1801, and this would be the creation of the UK. We have the ending of the French Revolutionary Wars, 1802, Anglo-Maratha War, Battle of Trafalgar, the Napoleonic Wars, Peninsular War, Anglo-Russian War, and War of 1812 with the USA. So England was not popular, lots of power struggles, lots of war, a realigning of power, restructuring of the government and the powers that be that were in England at that time. But then we also see 1807, the abolition of the Slave Trade Act. What do we just say was established 215 years earlier or around that time during the reign of Queen Mary was the slave trade. Now, this didn't abolish slavery, but it abolished the Slave Trade Act, and this would be a very Plutonian lesson in regards to the power and the abuse of power, the manipulation of power, directly corresponding with slavery, bondage, oppression. But this would be the lesson of power, the abolition of the Slave Trade Act. And this is important because, again, since the United States draws its roots from England and Great Britain, it was because of what was happening with the slave trade that became part of the founding of the United States of America. The last country I'd like to explore a little bit's history is Japan. Now, Japan has a rich history spanning thousands of years, but I do just want to focus on the recent history. Now, I do have to look at my notes, but from 1603 to 1867 was the Edo period. That was said to be a 250-year period ruled by the Tokugawa family. It was said to be a very peaceful, prosperous time of Japan, Japan was kind of isolated and didn't involve itself in the affairs of other countries too much during this period, but just focused on developing in their country. And it was a very peaceful time, according to some of the things I've read. And that changed towards the end of that 250-year cycle when that revision of power came up and it was challenged, and it did not survive that Pluto return. So here's a country in recent history that did have a reformation and revolution of its government, and a new government basically took place. This would be when the power was given back to the imperial court and the rise of the Meiji dynasty, the return of imperialism to Japan. And this would be at the beginning of 1868, establishing a new chart for Japan. And we're going to take a look at that. So here's the chart of Japan after the end of the Edo period, the beginning of the Meiji Constitution and dynasty. And as it was basically the death of the old government, it's considered the death of the country. And now, with the birth of this new government, we have a new birth chart for Japan. And this is how new birth charts and new birthdays for certain countries come about, and new astrological charts for that country come to exist. In this chart, we can see that the attitude and personality of Japan completely changes from the previous era, whereas Japan was more conservative and practical and kind of kept to itself. In this new chart, we have the sun in Aquarius. This is said to have been a time where Japan opened its borders to technologies and inventions of other countries that it had not done before. Aquarius is a sign of social networks and reaching out to other countries, right? So they invited, but this was also a time where Japan grew its borders and tried to expand its empire a little bit. Pluto in this chart we see is in the first house. Now, the first house is the house of self, the house of your personal goals. Pluto in the first house has a lot of power to your personal goals, but on the dark side, it can create a craving of power, to want to be the most powerful, the number one, being in the first house. We'll talk about the US chart in a moment, but the United States of America has the Pluto in the second house in their native chart. And we are a country that focuses a lot on money, the power of money, building up wealth and materialism. But in this particular chart of Japan, 1889, again, we see Pluto in the first house, power, a kind of craving of power, craving of wanting to expand its borders, and of course, which led into World War II. And even though during that time, America still wasn't sure which side they were going to take, America did cut off oil supply to Japan because of what it was doing to other Asian countries, and they didn't agree with it, which caused Japan to bomb Pearl Harbor. It was a risk, it was a gamble. They thought the US would negotiate peacefully and it could be the end of that. But they didn't expect the United States to retaliate, but they did. And the United States entering to the World War II was a major turning point. This was also a major rise of power for the United States. So after World War II, again, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese government and country was completely revolutionized. And then there was a new government that rose up, and this would create the new chart for Japan, which is now what astrologers go by, which was May 3rd, 1947. And in this particular chart for Japan, one of the big differences, of course, we have the sun in Taurus now instead of Aquarius. So Taurus is a very practical, stable sign, earth sign, takes things slowly, also likes to enjoy the finer things of life. And in this chart, we see Pluto in the seventh house. Japan now finds its power through working with others and creates powerful relationships. And that is now the source of the power for this new chart in the country of Japan. So, what a huge difference from when Pluto was in the first house, and we had Japan as an enemy of the United States. And then with the new chart of Japan, now Pluto in the seventh house, and now Japan is an ally of the United States. And it's interesting how it's really come full circle. And that karma almost is like it's been repaid, and now Japan is an ally of the United States. But we will talk about World War II and again in just a moment, as now we go into the chart for the United States and really get into the meat of the Pluto return of the United States and how this is going to affect us as a country and what to kind of expect and plan for. Pluto is found in the 27th degree of Capricorn, and this is the exact spot of that we're looking to of when Pluto gets to that 27th degree of Capricorn again. And it took close to 250 years, 2022. Last year was when it reached that point of when it reached the exact point of when it returned. That's why we call it the Pluto return, returning to the exact point of where it was when this country was born. Um, Typically, if we're looking at this as a birth chart of a country, we can kind of read it as a birth chart of a person. Looking at the big three of the country, the sun, the moon, and the ascendant. Our sun is in Cancer, sun in the seventh house. Relationships and partnerships are very important to America, illumination on that seventh house. But sun in Cancer gives an attitude of being very protective, very defensive of our country. Moon in Aquarius, emotionally speaking, we derive emotional satisfaction from thoughts of liberation and equality and progressiveness and inviting inventions and technology into this country. And then, of course, the ascendant of Sagittarius. Sagittarius is about exploring other cultures and other foreign places, languages, bringing them all together. And America is known to always be interested in the affairs of other countries for its lifetime for the past 250 years. So the date that this Pluto return happened, we cast the chart for that moment, and that can give us some insight in regards to what to expect in regards to the Pluto return. And then we can kind of identify some themes. This is just typical of any return chart. So just to show you what this chart just does, of course, look different, but inside will be the birth chart of the United States. Outside, the green glyphs are the planets' placements at the time Pluto reached that mark. So in this chart, the planets on the outside, Pluto again is the second house, the house of money, material possessions, property, values, ethics, morals. We also see Venus and Mars in the second house, indicating the review of the relationships between money. Mercury in the second house and Saturn in the second house. So a stellium in the second house, huge focus on issues of the second house, the things that we value, not always materialistic possessions, ethics, morality, but definitely attached to property and money and wealth as well. Pluto in the second house for the country's birth chart points to the power of the nation being derived from money, wealth. America has been a wealthy nation with its citizens being able to acquire wealth, some starting with nothing. But also, there's been kind of an overfocus of money in this country and materialism and that sort of thing in several sectors of the United States. But the other thing that we see about the power of Pluto landing in that second house is the powerful statements that created this country. We see that in the Declaration of the Independence. And so these are the establishment of the power of this country is really what is going to be coming up for review with the Pluto return. And we're going to go through and see at different points of the transits of Pluto where the lessons of Pluto directly came up for this country, and we will see and explore how we've learned from those lessons. I was not always into history, but I definitely got into history when I moved to Virginia. And of course, people who know Virginia was the first state, first colony, Jamestown. I got to see all of that. I got to go visit Jamestown, Williamsburg, a lot of really cool places. I mean, there's history around every corner, including this church in Richmond, St. John's Church. And this is a famous church because This is where Patrick Henry gave the famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." This was in 1775. A portion of it is on a plaque across the street. In this picture, it says, "Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." And that was said to be the speech that motivated the American forces to start the revolution, American Revolution, fight back, and also declare its independence of this country. So we've already established that the United States of America derives its power from the characteristics of the second house, which have to do with money, wealth, morals, ethics, and we see even very powerful statements that are associated with Pluto in the Declaration of Independence. Remembering that Pluto has to deal with oppression, bondage, and even slavery, we see that this beautiful words of all men are created equal, all men have God-given rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And meanwhile, these men that were signing these beautiful words to these documents, most of them owned slaves. And so there is an irony there, of course. But the other part of that Declaration of Independence states that to secure these rights, and I'm reading it verbatim here, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that whenever form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. When this is one of the founding principles of the country and of the government that established the power of the United States of America, these are the principles that will be up for review. And the dark side of America presenting itself as a freedom loving country, but on the dark side, having the institution of slavery abound and the institution of genocide with the Native American people and all of the other dark sides of the history that we know of, that we didn't learn in school, that the history didn't teach us. So these are becomes all part of the things that come up for review during this return of Pluto. So let's see how we did with the checkpoints of the lessons of Pluto. So the checkpoints are the square, the opposition. Just like in a Saturn's return, Saturn takes about 29 years to go around the sun. We've got checkpoints at, you divide it by 4, we got checkpoints at 7 years, 14 years, 21, and then the Saturn's return 2029. So with same thing with Pluto. Now it's not the same exact years because we already talked about that and how Pluto goes around the sun. It is not always equal amount of years in that revolution around the sun. However, we will see the checkpoints of when Pluto made its first square, Pluto opposition, the last square, and then now we reach full circle to the final exam, which is now the Pluto return we're going through. The first time Pluto squared its natal placement of Pluto happened around 1848. And this is the first challenge or kind of point of crisis when we are talking about the movement of Pluto around the entire zodiac. So this is kind of like the first challenge to the establishment of the power of the United States, and in a way challenge some of those core beliefs that this country was founded upon. And what happened in 1848? Well, Texas was admitted to the Union, and part of the big fight between Mexico and Texas was over slavery. Mexico had already abolished slavery, and Texas wanted to keep it. So much so that that little strip above the Texas border that is Oklahoma came to be because that line right above Oklahoma is said to be the line where it was illegal for slavery north of that line. And Texas wanted to stay so far away from that line so much that they gave up a small portion of land, which is that little strip above Texas, which is Oklahoma. So, did we learn from the principles that we said we were going to keep true to? And at this point, it doesn't seem like it. And we're still fighting to keep the institution of slavery alive, while saying that we are for freedom and liberty of all. And this would directly lead into, the next few years, which led into the Civil War. And the Civil War broke out and, of course, ended up finally abolishing slavery in the United States. The next point of crisis of Pluto connecting with Pluto again would be at the opposition point, where Pluto is directly opposite of its natal position. And this would be around the time of 1939. So, leading up to this date and even the years after, we get a glimpse of the lesson of Pluto. Now, Pluto being opposite Pluto, it is about expansion, growth, a tug of war, and a expanding, but also a test to see if the power that has been given could be handled and managed responsibly. What happened right before this point was the Great Depression. So, being the opposite point of Pluto, this does give us a peek of what could happen in our economy now. And with the complete return of the complete return of Pluto. This point of opposition was also right before World War II, which again, America hadn't even really decided they were going to enter, but at the same time, it is what propelled them to become a world superpower, recognized as a world power. It is the time when the power of America and the United States expanded and grew. And this is why it's interesting that, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, um, it could have been actually the event that did push America into that position. However, America's response also established it as a very powerful country after that. And also during this time, we had what was called the Dust Bowl in America, in the Midwest. This was due to, had a lot to do with human contribution of a human messing up the soil and not uh, administering those same agricultural practices they'd had done for so many years, trying to do things a new way. That contributed to a lot, but a lot of high winds, drought, of course, added to what they was considered the Dust Bowl, and that is another clue, being that opposite point of looking at things in a different um, perspective. It's like a reflection of a mirror almost. And now reaching the Pluto return of today, we could potentially see some environmental issues. We've already seen a very dusty and windy tornado season as soon as Pluto entered into Aquarius. But this is the point of being opposite of Pluto, the point of expansion, growth, and testing of that power. During this time was also around the time Trump was born. Trump kind of symbolizes that era, So when he says he wants to make America great again, I envision that he's talking about the time when America was the most powerful, the most influential. But again, it was also the American dream that didn't fit everyone's dream. And what America stood for back then, a lot of people were still marginalized. During World War II, we had some of the most atrocious human rights uh, violations that the United States have been accused for. And starting when they began to put all of Japanese people in internment camps due to what Japan did. And this was all along the country, but they also influenced Canada, Peru, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina to do the same and imprison Japanese people and even send Japanese people to the United States to be imprisoned over here. So did America use their power, wisely? That of course could be up for debate when we're talking about acts of war, but at the same time, that same issue of race comes up and treating people subhuman almost, and people were tortured and they were treated inhumane, and those are said to be some of the biggest atrocities that America committed. Let's keep going here to the next checkpoint of the last square of Pluto. Pluto and Libra squaring Pluto and Capricorn. This was around the time of the early 1980s. In 1980 was when the Civil War broke out in El Salvador, and United States involvement is said to have perpetuated that war, which ended up lasting over a decade. And the Salvadorian people's country was completely just transformed and destroyed, and it just went through a really tough time with that really long civil war. But it is said, and if you research it, that America perpetuated a lot of atrocities that didn't need to happen. The United Nations has even accused the United States of inhumane acts of torture and that sort of thing in regards to that. We also, during this time, had Kuwait and the wars in Libya. This is just coming off of the wars of Vietnam, and it was all about control, trying to expand their power and their influence, and a lot of it had to do with oil, wars on oil. Um, Back in 1939, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor because of oil. Back in 1848, it may not have been a huge Plutonian part, but remember, Plutonian, Pluton, the word Pluton comes from the word wealth and also deep wealth in the earth, mining from the earth, representing the seeds of wealth that will grow, all the minerals in the earth is associated with Pluto. Another interesting thing I just learned about Pluto is archetypally, Pluto is associated with toxins, refuse, hazardous materials as well. And what have we seen during this year, in the second year now of the Pluto return to the United States? Tons and tons of derailments and chemical spills and waters being polluted. And this could be, again, some of that environmental disaster that gave us a peak in the 30s with the Dust Bowl, where eventually our food supply is going to be affected, and there could even be sickness because of those hazardous materials and refuse and toxins and garbage. So 1983 was the last square, and in the early 80s, we see the influence that now the United States has as a world power, and such as situations like Vietnam. Um, we also had, after World War II, a realigning of territories, and this, I believe, had a lot to do with Uranus and Gemini. Uranus and Gemini is about carving out different types of territories. This happened after World War II, 84 years before that, in the 1860s, the same thing. And if you go back, every time Uranus is in Gemini, there's a realigning of countries. We might see that again with Uranus going into Gemini in a few years, 2025, 2026. We may see the division of the UK being into the four countries: Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, England, and Scotland. We may see the other countries divided up, like Germany or other countries in Europe and in other parts of the world, and even here in America, which could be part of the Pluto return that we'll see in a couple of years. But Uranus and Gemini is going to be an interesting transit, because Gemini is all about communication, the media, journalism. Journalism has been completely transformed by the cell phones and people doing their own journalism live, sometimes beating the news on these apps like Instagram and TikTok and other apps. And so now we've come full circle to 2022, the current period, and we have now, this is like the final exam. These were the checkpoints of power, where power was tested, power was checked, or power was expanded and grew with the United States. And now we're coming full circle, reviewing all of those issues. But the key points that we are talking about has to do with oppression, slavery, atrocious acts of slavery, bondage that America has done within its history. Human rights in general are coming up for review. All of the resources that this country has fought for, including oil. What's happening around the world with oil? People are changing the way they deal with transactions with the United States in regards to oil. So some of those things that America fought for when they had the power to do so are coming up for review. And there may be some karma related in those decisions with other countries doing business with America. We also see at the different checkpoints um, the oppression, the bondage against slavery coming up. And it's interesting how when Pluto entered Capricorn, remind you, Pluto in 27th degree is kind of towards the end of Capricorn, but as Pluto entered Capricorn, what did we see but a complete collapse of the US economy and the first Black president with an Islamic sounding name on top of that? Almost like if the Pluto in Capricorn was saying, hey, here we go. We're revisiting these um, same issues that this country was founded on that have always been present in regards to race and racism and slavery and all those other things. And then what happened immediately after Barack Obama's term? We got Trump, which in a way to me symbolizes the last grab of power of what this country may have wanted to become in the beginning. And now it's coming face to face with that reality that that may not happen. So, in conclusion, it is my belief that this country in the United States, we do live in a country that was founded on some amazing principles and ideas. The idea that one could live here how they chose to live, regardless of their religion or race or color, and they could be able to have that ability to pursue happiness, to have life, to have liberty, was a dream that many people wanted to attain, and some do even to this day. So to put that out to the world that this is what this country was going to be established on, that to me was the true American dream. And not just to have a government that was not oppressive, but supportive in helping you to find your life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and to say, we are here for you and we're governed by you. That is a very powerful ideology that was put out. And as we know, the ascendant in the USA chart is Sagittarius. Sagittarius is very optimistic and philosophical. So we put out these amazing, beautiful evolutionary ideals, and it came at a time where these enlightening people were signing this document, all the while owning slaves. So we know that the dark side of America is that while we were putting out these powerful and evolutionary ideas, from the very beginning, this country has had that dark side of slavery and oppression, and also claiming things monetarily and property wise at the expense of other peoples and other nations. And we saw this in the first checkpoint, which was the first test when around the time oil was discovered, creating the oil boom and a huge source of wealth for America in Texas. And of course, around the time Texas was admitted to a state, and the fight for having slavery in Texas with Mexico first occurred. Then at the opposition in the 40s, where there was a lot of segregation, and of course, there was a lot of racism in that time, but also the inhumane acts that were done to the Japanese people with the intern camps because of what Japan did in World War II. Then we have into the 80s, the El Salvador contribution to the Civil War, just coming off of Vietnam, leading into Libya, Kuwait, other oil wars. And we see that also when it comes to that racism, that first checkpoint, we, fought to keep slavery in Texas. But then right after that, it led right into the abolishment of slavery not too long after that. Then at the next checkpoint, we had again the segregation, the maltreatment of the Japanese people. But right after that, we had the civil rights movement in the 60s. And then in the early 80s, that checkpoint, there was the case of the 4 white cops that were deemed innocent by an all-white jury in Florida that started the Miami riots. And then, of course, even though that checkpoint was there, that led into all the race riots and a lot of what we have seen even up until now. So it's been with us all along from the very beginning, and these checkpoints have highlighted the points and lessons regarding power, regarding money, wealth, oppression, bondage, and those are the themes of Pluto. Because Pluto rules governments and countries, the establishment of that power, Pluto in the second house for this country, making us a very wealthy nation and a powerful nation with money. These are all of the lessons of Pluto that come into play. What's interesting is that during that time, back when this country was formed, Pluto was just about to enter into Aquarius, and we went through a very revolutionary time, but also a time when there were a lot of young people were interested in politics, and a lot of men. Back in those days, it was like a very respectable thing to want to become a politician and be involved in those things. And I believe that going now into this next Pluto of Aquarius generation, we will see a resurgence of interest in politics by our young people and this new generation that is coming up. A lot of kids that were born during the Pluto and Sagittarius era are now becoming eligible to vote, and they're becoming older to vote. And Sagittarius is the sign that rules politics and law and philosophy, as well as Aquarius. Aquarius is very much about social circles and independence and how we use our networks for gain and for income and all of those things. So leading into this Pluto and Aquarius generation, I do believe we'll see that resurgence of interest in politics. And as far as world powers go, with the reduction of possible reduction of influence and power for America and possible decline of United States of America as a world power, there is always the rise of a new power. And I didn't mention it previously, I meant to, but when we're looking at the Japan's chart, the new chart for 1947, Pluto is found in Leo, I believe in the 10th degree. So Pluto is in Aquarius right now, pointing to the opposition is coming very soon for that Pluto opposition, Pluto with Japan. And then, of course, I mentioned already China. I believe China is the 15th degree, so it's after Japan. And there could be other, but those are two countries that in their birth chart have Pluto and Leo. And with the Pluto and Aquarius transit for the next 20 years, as it gets closer to that point, we could definitely see the expansion and growth of power with those countries through Pluto, with Japan, with China. Those are two countries definitely that have Leo, Pluto, Leo. And so those could be the two new world powers we may potentially see just based on astrology. It is going to depend a lot on what our country does with all of these dilemmas and problems that have come up, and whether or not we've managed our power responsibly, and whether or not we will do that again in the future. And if not, it could be taken away. One of the questions that came up was, what should we be doing as the citizens here in this country that is experiencing its Pluto return? And the answer for that isn't very simple. However, we can be aware. We can be aware of what's happening and know that these issues are coming up for review. And those issues that have to do with the wealth of this country, the misabuse of power in regards to those values and ethics and morals, the things that this country was supposed to be standing upon, the real American dream that this country was founded upon. Those are all the things that are coming up. And with that awareness, of course, we want to make sure we are making wise decisions with our voting, with our investments, with our own money. This is probably a time to maybe not make too many risky investments in this country. Um, but we're also seeing a revolution in regards to our currency and what led up to the creation of the Federal Reserve System and all of those panics, people pulling money out of the bank. We're kind of seeing a little repetition with that new system moving into the digitized era and this electronic funding, FedNow and all the Cash App and other apps that are out there and all of those issues that we are seeing come up with that. This will be a dark time for this country, unfortunately, and it is what it is. The unearthing of the dark side of this country is coming out, so we can address it and hopefully move past it and even embrace it instead of trying to hide it. And part of the healing process is acknowledging that things actually happened, and then we can tend to the wound and heal it and release it. A lot of things such as slavery and other segregation, even Black Wall Street that happened in Tulsa, I never even knew about until recently. Those are things that history has tried to erase. So hopefully, with acknowledging those things, we can start to finally heal from the history of this country. And hopefully we will begin to move forward in a new direction, and we may see a lot of restructuring even in politics and even in this government. So while all of these dark sides are coming up, I'm reminded of the quote that Jung said, that part of being enlightened is not imagining white figures of light everywhere, but embracing the darkness or making the darkness conscious. And that's kind of what we have to do. We're facing those shadows, and we have to stop, uh, discontinue from denying that those types of things ever happened in this country. That's the first step. So with that, just want to say thank you guys for joining me on this journey. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe if you haven't already. Feel free to comment below or any questions, feedback as well. And I hope to see you all in the next video. The next one should be an astro forecast. We're heading into eclipse season and the switching of the nodes from the Taurus Scorpio nodes to Aries and Libra. Still Venus Mars influenced, but different signs. And we'll be talking about that in the next video. So take care, all of my friends and Astro fam. Thank you for your support, and see you in our next video. Take care.